Welcome back to Solentha Stories. Let's fuel your day with some intense passion and non-stop excitement. Grab your gear, we're moving into the story now.
I'm Kimberly, 32, and my husband just asked me to sign papers that would put everything we owned in both our names. He said it was for our future. What he didn't know was that I was about to hand him exactly what he deserved. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like something wasn't quite right but couldn't put your finger on it. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me back up to January, when this whole thing started. David walked into our cramped apartment that Tuesday evening with this ridiculous grin on his face, like he'd just solved world hunger or something. He had papers in his hand and this energy that made me immediately suspicious. After 8 years of marriage, I knew his tells. "Baby," he said, spreading documents across our tiny kitchen table like he was presenting the crown jewels. "I've got the opportunity of a lifetime here." I glanced at the papers while stirring pasta. Mortgage pre-approval letters, car loan applications, credit card offers. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice neutral. "What kind of opportunity?" "A house, Kim. Not just any house. A real house. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2-car garage in Maplewood Heights, and cars to match. We're talking about finally living like we deserve. Maplewood Heights, where the lawyers and doctors lived, where I'd driven through on Sunday afternoons, windows down, imagining what it would feel like to belong somewhere like that. "David, we can't afford Maplewood Heights. My salary is good, but it's not miracle worker good." He laughed, that confident laugh that used to make me feel safe, but now made me wonder what I was missing. "That's the beauty of it. Your promotion is coming through, right? That 40% salary increase you mentioned?" I had mentioned that 3 months ago, before my boss decided to restructure the department and freeze all promotions indefinitely. I'd told David about the setback, but apparently selective hearing was one of his many talents. "And my business is finally taking off," he continued, not waiting for my answer. "The Hendricks contract is practically signed. Peterson Industries is interested. We're talking serious money, Kim, the kind that makes everything we've done worth it." I'd heard about these contracts before. They were always practically signed or almost finalized. Funny how none of them ever actually materialized into bank deposits. "So, what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, though I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. "We leverage your current income and my future earnings. Take out mortgages, car loans, the works. Build the life we've always talked about." He gestured around our apartment with obvious distaste. "No more living like college students. And if your contracts don't come through?" His expression shifted, just slightly. The confidence wavered for maybe 2 seconds before snapping back into place. "They will. But if something unexpected happens, we'll figure it out. We always do." Right. We always figured it out. By we, he meant me working overtime while he figured out why his latest sure thing had fallen through. But looking at those papers, at his hopeful face, at the pre-approval letters that could actually get us that house, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not excitement, exactly. More like clarity. "Okay," I said quietly. "Let's do it." His face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "On one condition." His smile faltered slightly. "What condition?" "Everything gets financed. No down payments from our savings. No cash purchases. Everything goes through banks, with proper documentation." "That's actually smart," he said, though I could see him processing why I'd want everything on paper. Tax benefits, building credit history, keeping our liquid assets free for other investments. I nodded, letting him think he'd figured out my reasoning. Men like David loved explaining back to you why your ideas made sense. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't thinking about tax benefits. I was thinking about legal liability, about whose name would be on which documents when this house of cards inevitably collapsed. Because David might have been a lot of things, but financially responsible wasn't one of them. And after 8 years of watching him chase one get-rich-quick scheme after another, I'd learned to protect myself. The house was beautiful, I'll give him that. Red brick colonial with white shutters, wraparound porch, mature oak trees in the front yard. The kind of house where you could imagine hosting dinner parties and watching kids play in the backyard. Too bad neither of us could actually afford it. But David signed those papers with the confidence of someone who'd never met a bill he couldn't charm someone else into paying. February brought new routines and old patterns. David insisted on taking professional photos in front of our new house for his LinkedIn profile. Because nothing says successful entrepreneur like posing with assets you can't afford, right? I found myself doing the math constantly. Mortgage payment, $3,200 monthly. 2 car payments, $850 total. property taxes, insurance, utilities. The numbers swam in my head while I watched David post pictures of our success story on social media. The funny thing about living beyond your means is how normal it feels at first. You write the checks, you make the payments, you pretend the growing credit card balance is just temporary. It's like slowly turning up the heat under a frog. By the time you realize you're cooking, it's too late to jump out. David had converted the spare bedroom into his office, complete with a standing desk and one of those expensive ergonomic chairs that cost more than our old monthly rent. He spent hours in there on conference calls, voice carrying through the thin walls. "The Henderson project is moving faster than expected," I'd hear him say. "Peterson Industries wants to expand the scope." Always the same names. Henderson, Peterson, sometimes Michaels or Williams. A rotating cast of business contacts who seemed very interested in David's services, but remarkably slow to actually pay for them. I started paying attention to patterns. The calls always happened when I was home, like he needed an audience. The contracts were always just about to be signed, the checks always in the mail. And somehow, despite all this promising business activity, our joint account never reflected any income from his end. When I asked about it directly, David had explanations. Always explanations. "Business accounting is complicated, Kim. Everything's structured through LLCs and holding companies. The money's there, it's just tied up in the corporate structure until the quarterly distributions." Right, because that's definitely how small business consulting worked. Meanwhile, my actual salary, the one that existed in reality rather than imagination, was stretched thinner than a yoga instructor. Between the mortgage, car payments, utilities, groceries, and David's tendency to buy expensive office equipment for the business, I was living paycheck to paycheck for the first time in my adult life. But David seemed genuinely oblivious to our financial reality. He'd come home with bags from Williams-Sonoma or Best Buy, talking about networking events and client entertainment expenses. When I mentioned our dwindling checking account balance, he'd wave away my concerns. "You worry too much. The Hendricks money hits next week, and then we'll be fine." Except next week came and went without any mysterious deposits appearing. The real wake-up call came when I was organizing our mail one afternoon. I'd started opening everything, partly out of financial anxiety and partly because David had this habit of letting bills pile up on his desk for review later. Hidden in a stack of investment brochures and business magazines, I found 3 credit card statements addressed to David. Cards I didn't know existed. Balances I definitely couldn't explain. $4,200 on a Chase card, $2,800 on American Express, $1,600 on something called a Business Solutions Visa. My hands shook as I read through the charges. Expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel stays in cities he'd never mentioned visiting, purchases at stores that didn't align with any business needs I could identify. When David came home that evening, I had the statements laid out on the kitchen counter like evidence at a crime scene. "We need to talk about these," I said, keeping my voice steady. He glanced at the papers and immediately shifted into damage control mode. "Oh, those. Yeah, I've been meaning to mention the business credit situation." Business credit situation? For tax purposes, I had to separate personal and business expenses. These are all legitimate business costs, client entertainment, travel, equipment purchases. The accountant recommended setting up dedicated business credit lines. "David, this looks like $8,000 in credit card debt. Investment, not debt. There's a difference. Everything here generates business value that'll pay for itself 10 times over." I picked up the American Express statement and pointed to a $400 charge at a steakhouse in downtown Charlotte. "What business value does dinner at Morton's generate?" "Client entertainment for the Peterson Industries contract. I told you about that dinner." Except he hadn't told me about any dinner, or any trip to Charlotte, or any client meetings that required 4-star hotel accommodations. "Kim, you have to trust me here. I know it looks like a lot, but this is how business works. You spend money to make money. These investments are going to pay off huge." I stared at him, this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, and realized I had no idea who he actually was. The David I married was ambitious but honest. This David was something else. "Okay," I said finally. "I trust you." His relief was visible. "Good, because I promise you, by summer we'll be looking at these statements and laughing about how worried you were." I nodded and smiled and cleaned up the papers. But that night, lying in our king-sized bed in our beautiful house we couldn't afford, I made a decision. I was going to start protecting myself. March felt like living in a house of mirrors. Everything looked normal from the right angle, but step sideways and the whole picture warped into something unrecognizable. David's morning routine had evolved into performance art. He'd emerge from his office each day around 8 a.m., dressed like he was heading to board meetings, checking his phone with the focused intensity of someone managing international crises. "Big day today," he'd announce, grabbing his coffee and kissing my cheek. Hendricks wants to move up the timeline on phase 2. I'd learned to decode David's speak by now. Big day meant more mysterious phone calls from his office. Phase 2 meant the imaginary money was taking longer to materialize than phase 1's imaginary money. The credit card statements kept coming. By mid-March, I'd discovered 6 different accounts, all showing steadily climbing balances. David's explanations had grown more elaborate, involving complex business structures and delayed payment schedules that apparently only he understood. But it was the bank statements that really caught my attention. Our joint checking account showed regular transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. Not huge amounts, $300 here, $500 there, but consistent enough to create a pattern. When I asked David about them, he had that explanation ready too. Investment accounts. I'm diversifying our holdings, spreading risk across multiple portfolios. What kind of investments? Cryptocurrency. Mostly. Some forex trading. High-yield opportunities that require quick movement on favorable market conditions. Right. Because David had suddenly become a day trader without mentioning it. The thing about lies is they require maintenance. Like houseplants or vintage cars, you have to keep feeding them attention or they die. David was spending more and more energy keeping his story consistent, which meant longer hours at the office and less availability for questions about mundane things like bills or budgets. I'd started my own filing system. Every bank statement, every credit card bill, every suspicious receipt got photographed and stored in a folder on my laptop titled Home Office Organization. David never asked what I was organizing. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when David left his laptop open while taking a phone call on the back porch. I wasn't snooping exactly. I was walking past his desk when I saw an email notification pop up on the screen from someone named Rebecca Torres. The preview text was enough to stop me in my tracks. The accounts are set up as discussed. Transfer when ready. I glanced toward the porch, where David was still talking animatedly about quarterly projections or market volatility, or whatever he discussed during these marathon phone sessions. Without really deciding to, I clicked on the email. What I found was 6 months of correspondence about something called Torres Consulting Solutions. Rebecca Torres, apparently, was David's business partner. The business partner he'd never mentioned, in a company I'd never heard of. The emails painted a picture that made my stomach clench. David and Rebecca had been operating a consulting business together since last fall. They had shared bank accounts, shared clients, and based on the tone of their communications, shared a lot more than just professional interest. But here's what really made my hands shake. The money was real. The Hendricks contract David kept talking about? It had been completed and paid in full 3 months ago. Peterson Industries? They'd signed a 6-figure deal in February. All those mysterious clients whose checks were perpetually in the mail had actually paid up. The money existed. It just wasn't coming to our joint account. I scrolled through email after email, watching David's double life unfold in real time. Business trips that were really weekend getaways with Rebecca, client dinners that were romantic evenings at expensive restaurants, even vacation photos from Cabo that Rebecca had sent with a subject line reading, "Missing you already." My husband wasn't just bad with money, he was stealing from our marriage to fund his affair. I heard the back door open and quickly closed the laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. David walked back into his office, phone still pressed to his ear. "Absolutely. We can accelerate the timeline," he was saying. "Rebecca and I discussed this yesterday, and we're confident about the delivery schedule." Rebecca and I. Like they were a team. Like they were partners in every sense of the word. I walked calmly to our bedroom and closed the door before the tears came. Not tears of heartbreak, exactly. Tears of rage, of betrayal, of absolute crystal clarity about what I needed to do next. David thought he was playing chess while I played checkers. He thought I was the financially naive wife who wouldn't notice his increasingly creative accounting methods. He thought wrong. That evening, I made dinner like normal. We watched TV like normal. We went to bed like normal. But nothing was normal anymore because now I knew. The beautiful house, the expensive cars, the lifestyle upgrade I'd been so worried about affording, we could afford all of it. David just didn't want to afford it with me. So I was going to make sure that when this marriage ended, he got to keep exactly what he'd earned through his deception, which was going to be a lot less than he expected. April brought spring cleaning, though not the kind David was expecting. While he spent his days building the business with Rebecca, I spent mine building something of my own, a very careful, very legal financial strategy. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing our mortgage statement. David answered from his office, and I could hear his voice shift into that overly casual tone he used when he was about to lie. "Bridge loan?" he said, like he was surprised by the concept. "Yeah, we've discussed that possibility. The Hendricks payment is just delayed by their accounting department." Bridge loan. I grabbed a pen and wrote it down. "Right. No, I understand the timeline pressure, David continued. Maybe 2 weeks? Maximum 3. We'll have the full payment by then, plus penalties for the delay. After he hung up, I knocked on his office door. Everything okay? Just business stuff, he said without looking up from his computer. Sometimes clients need a little extra time to process payments. Growing pains of a successful company. Right. Growing pains. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 8 years of marriage. I stopped payment on our mortgage. Not permanently. Just for April. I called the bank and explained that there had been a banking error, and I needed to delay the automatic payment by a few weeks while it got sorted out. The customer service representative was understanding and accommodating. These things happen, she said. But here's the thing about mortgage payments. They don't disappear just because you don't make them. They accumulate. They generate late fees. They create paper trails and legal obligations that somebody eventually has to deal with. I also started making strategic decisions about our other monthly obligations. The car payments? Delayed by a week, then 2. The credit cards David had been using for his business expenses? Minimum payments only, letting the balances grow. Each decision was carefully calculated. Nothing that would immediately trigger collections or damage our credit scores. Nothing that would set off alarms in David's carefully constructed fantasy world. Just strategic delays. Meanwhile, I began what I thought of as Operation Personal Protection. Every paycheck before David could see the deposit, I transferred money to my mother's account. Not huge amounts that would be noticeable, but consistent contributions that I explained as family financial support. Mom's property taxes are higher this year, I told David when he questioned a $500 transfer. She needed some help with the spring payment. Your mom can't handle her own property taxes? David asked, though he seemed more annoyed about the interruption to his work than actually concerned about my mother's finances. She's getting older, David. Sometimes family needs help. He nodded absently and returned to his computer screen, to his secret emails with Rebecca, to his elaborate fiction about why the money kept flowing out instead of in. The beautiful irony was that David, in his infinite business wisdom, had insisted on putting both our names on everything. The house, the cars, the credit cards, all the financial obligations he'd talked me into. For tax purposes, he'd said. For optimal financial planning. What he hadn't considered was that joint ownership meant joint responsibility. Whatever happened to those obligations would legally be as much his problem as mine. By the end of April, I'd accumulated 4 weeks of strategic financial delays. Late fees were starting to accumulate, payment schedules were getting confused, but our credit scores hadn't taken any serious hits yet. And more importantly, David remained completely oblivious. He was too busy managing his double life to notice that his wife had started playing an entirely different game. The most satisfying part was watching him continue his charade. Every morning, he'd dress for success and head to his office to conduct important business with his imaginary schedule of client meetings. Every evening, he'd return with stories about productive conversations and promising developments. Meanwhile, I'd started documenting everything, not just the financial irregularities, but David's own words. The lies about client payments, the explanations about delayed contracts, the promises about money that would never arrive in our joint account because it was already sitting in accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. One evening in late April, David came home with champagne and Thai takeout from our favorite restaurant. "What's the occasion?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I could guess. "Peterson Industries came through," he said, popping the cork with theatrical flair. "6 figures, Kim. This changes everything." I smiled and accepted the champagne, letting him toast to our bright financial future, while I mentally calculated how many mortgage payments I could afford to delay with information like this. "That's wonderful," I said, clinking glasses with him. "When do you expect the money to come through?" "Should hit the account any day now," he lied with practiced ease. Any day now. Like the Hendricks money that had been coming any day now for 6 months. "I'm so proud of you," I told him. And I meant it. I was proud of him for being exactly as predictable as I'd expected. That night, as David slept beside me, probably dreaming about his double life with Rebecca, I lay awake planning his future. A future where he'd get to keep everything he'd worked so hard for, including all the bills. May arrived with the kind of beautiful weather that makes you believe good things are possible. I was working in our garden on a Saturday morning, pulling weeds and pretending our marriage wasn't falling apart, when opportunity knocked. Actually, opportunity rang. David's phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter while he showered, buzzed with an incoming email notification. I wasn't planning to look, honestly, but Rebecca Torres's name in the preview text was like a magnet for my eyes. Before I could stop myself, I was reading their latest exchange about weekend plans and how much she'd missed him during his family obligations. Family obligations. That's what I'd been reduced to. But this email was different. Instead of romantic planning or business strategy, Rebecca was sending him what looked like financial statements, bank account summaries showing deposits that made my chest tighten with recognition. The Hendricks contract, $47,000 deposited in March. Peterson Industries, $63,000 deposited in April. Williams & Associates, $22,000 deposited 2 weeks ago. Every single client David had been telling me about for months. Every contract he claimed was delayed or pending or held up in corporate bureaucracy. All of them paid, in full, months ago. But the money hadn't been delayed or lost or tied up in business structures. It had been deposited into accounts with Rebecca's name on them, accounts I was obviously never meant to discover. I photographed the entire email thread with shaking hands, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure David would hear it over the running shower. There were months of communications here, a complete record of his financial deception laid out in casual conversation. Transfer $15K to the Cayman account, from February. Kim's getting suspicious about the credit cards, from March. Maybe we should wait until after the divorce to buy the condo, from last week. The divorce. They were already planning my exit while I was still playing the supportive wife. I closed the phone and set it back exactly where David had left it. My hands surprisingly steady considering my whole world had just shifted off its axis. The shower was still running. David would emerge in 5 minutes, probably with some story about weekend client meetings or business conferences that would require him to be away from home. More lies. All lies. But here's what David didn't understand about me. I don't break down. I get strategic. By the time he came downstairs, toweling his hair and reaching for his phone, I was back outside pulling weeds with methodical precision. I've got to head out for a few hours, he called through the screen door. Peterson Industries wants to meet about expanding the project scope. On a Saturday? I asked, not looking up from the flower bed. Business doesn't follow a Monday through Friday schedule, Kim. This is how real success works. Right. Real success. With Rebecca. Drive safely, I told him, and I meant it. I wanted him to arrive safely at wherever he was actually going, because I needed him healthy and present for what was coming next. After his car pulled out of the driveway, I went inside and made 3 phone calls. First, to my mother. Mom, I need to transfer some more money to your account. A larger amount this time. Is everything all right? Honey? Everything's going to be fine. I just need to move some assets around for tax purposes. Second, to our mortgage company. I explained that our automatic payment system had been having technical difficulties, and I wanted to temporarily suspend the autopay feature while we sorted things out with our bank. Third, to each of our credit card companies. Similar story. Temporary technical issues with our payment processing. Please hold all automatic payments until further notice. By Monday morning, I'd effectively paused our entire financial obligation system. Every bill, every payment, every automatically scheduled transaction was now under my manual control. David, meanwhile, had spent the weekend working and returned Sunday evening with apologies about the extended business meetings and promises that all this extra effort would pay off soon. How soon? I asked over dinner, cutting into the expensive steak he'd brought home as a peace offering. Very soon. Baby, I'm talking life-changing money, the kind of success that makes all these sacrifices worth it. Life-changing money. He wasn't wrong about that. I smiled and nodded and asked appropriate follow-up questions about his business prospects. I even managed to sound genuinely interested in his elaborate explanations about market opportunities and client needs. But that night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake doing math. Not the desperate math I'd been doing for months, trying to figure out how to make our expenses work with my salary. Different math. David wanted our marriage to end. He'd been planning it with Rebecca for months, probably. He'd been systematically moving money out of our joint financial picture and into accounts I couldn't access. He thought he was setting up his exit strategy. What he'd actually done was hand me the perfect blueprint for his downfall. Because while David had been planning to leave me with nothing, I'd been learning exactly how much nothing he was about to inherit. June felt like the calm before a storm, except I was the one bringing the weather. David had settled into a routine of barely controlled excitement, like someone trying to contain good news that he wasn't ready to share yet. If I hadn't read his emails with Rebecca, I might have found his behavior endearing. He'd started working later, explaining that several major contracts were moving into their final phases. He'd bought new clothes, upgraded his phone, and had started going to the gym with sudden dedication. Classic pre-divorce preparation, getting ready for his new life. Meanwhile, I'd been preparing for his new life too, just not in the way he expected. 3 months of strategically delayed payments had created a fascinating financial landscape. Our mortgage was now 90 days behind, which triggered a series of increasingly urgent communications from the bank. The car payments had accumulated late fees that were approaching the value of the actual monthly payments. Credit card companies had begun calling with courtesy reminders about overdue balances. But here's the beautiful thing about joint debt. Both names are equally responsible for everything. David remained blissfully unaware of our deteriorating financial situation because he'd trained me, over 8 years of marriage, to handle all the tedious details of bill paying and account management. Bills came to the house, I dealt with them. Payment schedules and late fees and customer service calls were my domain. He was too busy building his future with Rebecca to notice that the foundation of our current life was systematically collapsing. The most satisfying part was watching him explain away the obvious warning signs. When the bank called about our missed mortgage payments, David happened to answer the phone. I listened from the kitchen as he smoothly deflected their concerns. There's been some confusion with our automatic payment system, he told them. My wife handles the account management, and we've been upgrading our banking platform for the business. She'll get this sorted out immediately. He hung up and called to me. Kim, the mortgage people called. Something about payment processing issues? I'll take care of it, I assured him. Just some technical problems with the bank transfer system. He nodded and returned to his office, completely satisfied with an explanation that didn't actually explain anything. The credit card companies were harder to dismiss, especially when they started calling his cell phone directly about the business accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. But David had explanations for everything. Cash flow management, he'd say when I asked about the increasingly frequent calls. When you're running multiple projects with different payment schedules, you have to juggle the timing sometimes. Right, timing. By the middle of June, I'd transferred $18,000 to my mother's account. Not all at once, and never in round numbers that might trigger attention. 700 here, 1,200 there, small amounts that looked like family support or personal spending rather than systematic asset protection. I'd also started a new routine, photographing every piece of financial documentation that came to our house. Bank statements, credit card bills, late payment notices. Everything went into my home organization folder with dates and descriptions. David never asked what I was organizing so meticulously. The phone calls from creditors had become a daily soundtrack to our household. David had started letting them go to voicemail, trusting me to handle the technical issues with our payment systems. What he didn't realize was that I was handling them exactly the way I wanted to. When mortgage companies called, I negotiated payment extensions. When credit card companies called, I arranged minimum payment schedules that would keep the accounts active while maximizing the accumulating interest. When the car financing companies called, I explained that we were experiencing temporary cash flow issues but expected resolution within 60 days. I was managing our financial collapse with the same precision I'd once used to manage our financial stability. The irony was perfect. David had spent months lying to me about money while secretly planning our divorce. Now I was planning our divorce by letting him inherit the exact financial situation his lies had created. One evening in late June, David came home with another bottle of champagne, and that barely contained excitement that had become his default expression. Big news, he announced, setting the bottle on our granite countertop like he was presenting evidence in court. Good big news or bad big news? I asked. Big, though I already knew the answer. Life-changing big news. The Peterson contract is expanding into a long-term partnership. We're talking about 7 figures over the next 2 years, Kim. This is everything we've been working toward. 7 figures. With Rebecca, of course. That's incredible, I said, accepting the champagne glass he offered. When does this partnership officially start? Next month. There might be some transition period while we restructure the business model, but by fall we'll be looking at a completely different financial picture. By fall. Right around the time David would probably ask for a divorce, I imagined. I'm so proud of you, I told him, raising my glass in a toast. You've worked so hard for this. We clinked glasses and drank champagne while 6 months of unpaid bills sat in neat piles in my office upstairs, and $18,000 sat safely in my mother's account, and David's entire financial future sat poised to collapse around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. To our future, David said, smiling with genuine warmth. To getting exactly what we deserve, I replied. He laughed, thinking we were toasting the same thing. We weren't. July brought the kind of heat that makes everything feel more intense, including the growing pile of overdue notices that had become my daily entertainment. 4 months of strategically delayed payments had created quite the collection. David, meanwhile, had entered what I like to think of as his pre-divorce shopping phase. New watch, new laptop, new gym membership at the fancy place downtown. Nothing says I'm about to leave my wife like suddenly caring about your appearance after 8 years of sweatpants and old t-shirts. The phone calls had become a symphony of financial consequences. Chase Bank called every Tuesday at 9 a.m. sharp. Wells Fargo preferred Thursday afternoons. American Express had started calling twice a day, which honestly felt a bit desperate, but I appreciated their persistence. The beautiful thing was watching David's reaction when these calls came in on the house phone. "Kimberly!" he'd shout from his office. "Your bank people are calling again." My bank people. As if I was personally running some kind of amateur financial institution from our kitchen counter. I'd dutifully answer each call with practiced concern. "Yes, I understand the account is past due. We've been having some technical difficulties with our automatic payment system." Technical difficulties. That was my favorite excuse because it sounded legitimate without actually meaning anything. What technical difficulties? The technical difficulty of me choosing not to push the pay bill button mostly. "Mrs. Patterson," the Chase representative said during one particularly memorable call, "we've sent multiple notices about your mortgage payments. Are you experiencing financial hardship?" Financial hardship. If only she knew that our checking account actually had enough money to cover 6 months of mortgage payments, sitting safely in my mother's name while David played house with Rebecca. "We're just restructuring some business accounts," I explained. "Everything should be resolved within the next few weeks." David had started buying me things, which was both touching and hilarious. Flowers on random Tuesdays, my favorite coffee from the expensive place across town, a necklace I'd mentioned liking 6 months ago. Classic guilty husband behavior, except David's guilt wasn't about the affair I already knew about. His guilt was about the divorce he was planning that he thought I didn't see coming. "You've been working so hard," he said one evening, presenting me with takeout from the Italian place we went to for anniversaries. "I wanted to do something special for you." Special. Right. Like the special way he'd been working late 3 nights a week for the past month, building his exit strategy with Rebecca while I built mine with unpaid bills. "You're so thoughtful," I told him, accepting the expensive pasta and wine like I was accepting communion, sacred lies shared between us. The credit card companies had gotten creative with their collection efforts. Instead of just calling our home number, they'd started reaching out to David's cell phone directly about the business accounts he thought I didn't know existed. Algumas ligações chegavam direto no celular do David, mas ele sempre dizia, "Fala com a Kim, ela cuida dessas coisas," e desligava antes que pudessem explicar o motivo da ligação. I'd watch him step onto the back porch to take these calls, his voice shifting into that smooth, confident tone he used when he needed to convince someone of something that wasn't quite true. "Cash flow timing," I'd hear him explain. "Large corporate clients have complex payment processing schedules." After these calls, David would come back inside with a slightly strained expression, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Everything okay?" I'd ask with genuine-sounding concern. "Just business stuff, some accounting delays with client payments." Accounting delays. The man was practically speaking in code at this point. By the end of July, I'd transferred another $4,000 to my mother's account. Small amounts, always with plausible explanations. Mom's air conditioning repair, contribution to my cousin's wedding gift, helping with her property taxes. David never questioned these transfers because David had trained himself not to pay attention to our actual financial reality. He was too busy living in his fantasy future with Rebecca to notice that his present was systematically falling apart. One evening while David was working late again, I spread all our overdue bills across the kitchen table like a poker hand. Mortgage, 4 months behind. Car payments, 3 months behind. Credit cards, accumulating interest at rates that would make a loan shark blush. But here's what David didn't understand about joint financial responsibility. When everything goes to hell, both names go down together. The phone rang, interrupting my bill-sorting meditation. Another creditor, probably, calling to discuss payment arrangements or threaten legal action. "Patterson Residence," I answered cheerfully. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Jennifer from Wells Fargo Auto Finance. I'm calling about your vehicle payments." "Of course. How can I help you?" "We've been trying to reach your husband about bringing the account current. The system shows several missed payments, and we're concerned about the account status." Concerned about the account status. Such polite language for, "You're about to lose your cars." "My husband handles most of our business communications," I said. "He's been traveling quite a bit lately for work. Very demanding client schedule." "I understand. Could you have him call us at his earliest convenience? We'd like to discuss payment options before the situation becomes more serious." "Absolutely. I'll make sure he gets the message." I hung up and added Jennifer's number to David's phone contacts with a note. "Call about car payments. Urgent. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below." David would discover that message tomorrow morning, and I'd get to watch him explain away another piece of our collapsing financial foundation. The best part was knowing that every delayed payment, every accumulating late fee, every angry phone call was building toward the exact future David thought he was creating for me. August felt like the financial equivalent of a slow-motion car accident, except I was the one who'd cut the brake lines and David was still pressing the accelerator. 5 months of strategically delayed payments had created what bank representatives were now calling a serious delinquency situation. I preferred to think of it as a learning experience for my soon-to-be ex-husband. The first official notification arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by certified mail while David was out having one of his mysterious client lunches that seemed to happen exclusively at restaurants near Rebecca's apartment. Notice of default on our mortgage. Such official language for such a simple concept. Pay up or get out. I signed for the envelope and tucked it safely into my expanding file of financial documentation. David would never see it unless he happened to check the mail himself, which had about the same probability as him suddenly developing transparency about his business dealings. The thing about David's affair was how completely it had consumed his attention. A year ago, he would have noticed changes in our mail delivery, asked questions about certified letters, maybe even opened a few bills out of curiosity. Now, he was so focused on managing his double life that he'd essentially handed me complete control of our financial reality, which was ironic, considering he was the one always lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. "Kim, have you been getting weird calls from the bank?" he asked one morning, glancing up from his phone with mild irritation. "Define weird," I said, buttering toast with careful precision. "They keep calling about payment confirmations or account reviews. I tell them to talk to you, but then they want to schedule appointments for both of us." Right. Because when you're 5 months behind on your mortgage, banks tend to want actual conversations rather than vague reassurances about technical difficulties. "I'll handle it," I assured him. Probably just routine account maintenance. David tinha começado a mandar todas as ligações de números desconhecidos direto para a caixa postal, alegando que era spam de telemarketing, conveniente para alguém que não queria ouvir sobre contas em atraso. He nodded and returned to his phone, where I'm sure Rebecca was texting him good morning messages that were far more interesting than discussing mundane things like keeping our house. The car situation had gotten particularly entertaining. Both vehicles were now 3 months behind on payments, which had triggered a series of increasingly urgent communications from the financing companies. They'd started calling David's cell phone directly, since his name was primary on both loans. I'd watch him step outside to take these calls, his voice shifting into damage control mode. "Temporary cash flow issue," I'd hear him explaining. "Large client payments are being processed through corporate accounts with extended settlement periods." Extended settlement periods. The man could make missing car payments sound like sophisticated business strategy. What David didn't realize was that I'd been having my own conversations with the auto finance companies. Very productive conversations about payment deferrals and account restructuring options. "We understand that life circumstances can change," the Wells Fargo representative had explained. "We have several programs designed to help customers through difficult periods." Difficult periods. If only she knew how deliberately difficult I was making things. I'd arranged a series of payment extensions that would keep our cars from being repossessed, while ensuring that every missed payment was carefully documented and legally attributed to both our names. The credit card situation was approaching what I thought of as beautiful chaos. 6 different accounts, 6 tagi, all with escalating balances and late fees that were compounding like interest in reverse. David had started getting collection calls at work, which created a whole new level of stress for him. Nothing ruins your professional image like having creditors track you down at the office. "I might need to change my phone number," he mentioned one evening, looking genuinely frazzled. "Some telemarketing companies have been getting really aggressive." Telemarketing companies. Sure, David. That's definitely what Chase Bank's collection department was doing, trying to sell him credit cards he already couldn't pay for. Meanwhile, I'd been having fascinating conversations with these same telemarketing companies about payment arrangements and settlement options. Did you know that if you miss enough payments on joint accounts, both account holders become equally responsible for the total debt, including all accumulated fees and interest? David didn't know that, but he was about to get a very expensive education. The most satisfying part of this whole process was watching David maintain his facade of business success while our financial foundation crumbled underneath him. He'd bought a new suit the previous week. Expensive, tailored, the kind of thing you buy when you want to look successful for someone whose opinion matters to you. "Big presentation next week," he'd explained, admiring himself in the bedroom mirror. "Peterson Industries wants to expand our partnership into international markets." International markets. With Rebecca, presumably, since she was his actual business partner in the company he'd never mentioned to his wife. I'd smiled and complimented his appearance and asked appropriate questions about his exciting business developments, all while knowing that Peterson Industries had already paid their bill months ago, and the money was sitting in accounts with Rebecca's name on them. "You look very successful," I told him, and I meant it. He did look successful. He looked like exactly the kind of man who could afford expensive suits and international business partnerships and whatever lifestyle he was planning to build with his affair partner. He just couldn't afford the house, cars, and credit card debt that were about to become exclusively his responsibility. That night, after David fell asleep, I went downstairs and opened my laptop to review our current financial situation. 5 months of missed mortgage payments, $16,000. 3 months of missed car payments, $2,550. Credit card debt with accumulated interest and fees, $47,000. Total joint financial obligations, over $65,000 in debt, all legally tied to David's name as much as mine. All of it about to become his problem exclusively. I closed the laptop and went back to bed, where David was sleeping peacefully, probably dreaming about his bright future with Rebecca. He had no idea how expensive that future was about to become. September arrived with the kind of crisp air that usually makes me optimistic about new beginnings. This year, it felt more like the perfect weather for watching carefully laid plans finally come together. 6 months of strategically managed financial chaos had created what the bank was now calling an unsustainable default situation. I called it David's inheritance package. The serious notices had started arriving with impressive frequency. Not just late payment reminders anymore, but official legal documents with words like foreclosure proceedings, and asset recovery, and court action pending. David still hadn't seen most of them, because David had trained himself not to notice inconvenient details like mail delivery or phone calls from financial institutions. He was too busy managing the logistics of his exit strategy. And boy, was he getting sloppy about hiding it. "I might need to travel more in the coming months," he announced over dinner one evening, cutting into his steak with the focused attention of someone practicing difficult conversations. "The business is expanding into new markets." New markets. Right. The market for starting over with your affair partner in a different city, probably. "That sounds exciting," I said, twirling pasta around my fork like I was genuinely interested in his fictional business developments. "How much more travel are we talking about?" "Hard to say. Maybe extended trips. Could be weeks at a time." Weeks at a time. The man was essentially announcing his departure plans without actually announcing them. "Will this affect our living situation?" I asked, like I was worried about being alone in our house that we hadn't actually paid for in 6 months. David's expression shifted slightly, like someone who'd been caught saying more than he intended. "Why would it affect our living situation?" "I just meant, if you're traveling for weeks at a time, should I be prepared to manage everything here by myself?" "You've been managing everything by yourself already," he said, which was both accurate and revealing. Yes, David, I had been managing everything, including managing the systematic destruction of our financial stability, in preparation for exactly this conversation. The foreclosure notice had arrived the previous week, delivered by a process server who looked exactly like you'd expect someone in that profession to look. Serious, efficient, completely uninterested in explanations about technical payment difficulties. "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said, handing me an envelope that felt heavier than paper should, "you've been served notice of foreclosure proceedings. Both homeowners need to respond within 30 days. Both homeowners." That was the key phrase that made everything legally beautiful. David's name was on every document, every obligation, every financial disaster that was about to unfold. I'd thanked the process server politely and added the foreclosure documents to my collection. David would discover them eventually, but only when I decided he was ready for that particular revelation. The credit card companies had moved beyond phone calls into what their representatives called intensive collection procedures. They were now sending representatives to our house during business hours, hoping to catch us for face-to-face discussions about payment arrangements. David had answered the door to one of these visits the previous Tuesday, and I'd watched through the window as his confident expression gradually shifted into confusion, then concern, then something approaching panic. "There must be some mistake," I'd heard him telling the collection agent. "My wife handles our account management. She would have mentioned if we were having payment difficulties." The collection agent had been patient but firm. "Sir, according to our records, your joint account is 6 months delinquent with a current balance, including fees of $23,847. We need to discuss immediate payment arrangements." David had taken the agent's business card and promised to look into the situation immediately, which apparently meant walking straight to his office and closing the door without asking me any questions about our $23,847 credit card balance. Because David didn't actually want to know the answers to questions about our financial reality. He just wanted to maintain plausible deniability until he could make our financial reality my problem exclusively. Which was perfect, because I was preparing to make our financial reality his problem exclusively. I'd started what I thought of as final asset protection procedures. Every remaining dollar from my paychecks was being transferred to my mother's account under the explanation of family financial planning. Emergency fund, I called it, for unexpected life changes. My mother, bless her, had stopped asking questions after I'd explained that David and I were restructuring our finances, and I wanted to make sure some money was protected during the transition period. "Are you and David having problems, honey?" she'd asked during one of our weekly phone calls. "We're having changes, Mom. I'll explain everything once I know how things are going to work out." Changes. That was a nice way to describe discovering your husband's affair and systematically destroying his financial future in response. The most beautiful part of this whole situation was watching David prepare for his new life while remaining completely oblivious to the landmine he was about to step on. He'd been getting mysterious phone calls that he took outside, conversations filled with words like timeline and logistics and transition planning. He'd started staying late at the office more frequently, coming home with explanations about project deadlines and client emergencies that required his immediate attention. One evening, I'd found him in his office staring at his laptop screen with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the confident satisfaction of successful business planning, but something more like nervous anticipation. "Everything okay?" I'd asked from the doorway. He'd quickly minimized whatever he'd been looking at and turned to give me that practiced smile he'd perfected over the past few months. "Just planning some upcoming business developments. Big decisions to make. Big decisions. Like when to ask for a divorce and how to explain why he deserved to keep everything we'd built together." "Need any input on your big decisions?" I asked sweetly. "I've got it handled," he said. "But thank you." I'd smiled and left him to his planning, secure in the knowledge that I had big decisions of my own to finalize. By the end of September, David would be ready to reveal his exit strategy, and I'd be ready to show him exactly what he was exiting into. October brought the kind of perfect fall weather that makes endings feel like new beginnings. David chose a Tuesday evening for his big announcement, which was considerate of him. Tuesdays had always been good days for life-changing conversations in our house. He'd prepared for this moment like a business presentation. I could see it in the way he'd organized his thoughts, chosen his outfit, even selected the right lighting in our living room for optimal dramatic effect. "Kim, we need to talk," he said, settling into the chair across from me with the posture of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "Of course," I replied, setting down my book like I was giving him my complete attention, which I was, just not in the way he expected. David cleared his throat and launched into what was obviously a prepared speech. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship, about where we are and where we're headed. Where we're headed." Past tense would have been more accurate, since he'd already decided where he was headed months ago. "With Rebecca. Our marriage isn't working, Kim. We both know that. We've grown apart. We want different things. And I think we'd both be happier if we stopped pretending otherwise." I nodded thoughtfully, like this was genuinely surprising news rather than the conclusion I'd been watching him build toward for 8 months. "I think we should get divorced," he continued, his voice taking on that corporate efficiency he used for difficult client conversations. "I know this is hard to hear, but I believe it's the right decision for both of us. The right decision for both of us." How thoughtful of him to include my best interests in his planning. "I see," I said quietly. "And what are you thinking in terms of logistics?" This was the part he'd been waiting for. David's expression shifted into something that might have been confidence if it hadn't been built on such complete ignorance of our actual situation. "I've talked to a lawyer about property division," he said. "Given that I've been the primary breadwinner and business developer in our relationship, I think the fair arrangement would be for me to keep the house and the cars. You can keep your personal belongings, obviously, and whatever's in your individual accounts." Primary breadwinner. I almost laughed. David's primary breadwinning had consisted of 6 months of imaginary income, while I'd paid every actual bill we had. "What about our joint accounts?" I asked. "I'll take responsibility for those as well," he said, like he was doing me a tremendous favor. "The checking account, savings, investment accounts. I'll handle the financial obligations that go with the assets." Financial obligations. If only he knew what those obligations actually included. "And I'll make sure you have enough to get started on your own," he added with practiced magnanimity. "A transition fund to help you establish independence." A transition fund? How generous. David was offering to give me my own money to help me recover from the divorce he was inflicting on me. That sounds... I paused, like I was struggling with emotions. That sounds very fair, actually. His surprise was visible. He'd expected tears, arguments, maybe threats about what I'd tell people about the reason for our divorce. He hadn't expected calm acceptance of his generous offer to take everything while leaving me with nothing. "Really?" he said. I was worried you might want to fight about the asset division. Why would I fight about it? I asked. You've clearly thought this through carefully. If you want to take responsibility for all our joint financial obligations, that seems reasonable. Joint financial obligations. I loved that phrase because it sounded so neutral, so businesslike. Like we were discussing quarterly reports rather than 7 months of accumulated debt that was about to become exclusively his problem. Exactly, David said, his confidence building. I want to make this as smooth as possible for both of us. Smooth. That was one way to describe the financial catastrophe he was volunteering to inherit. There's one more thing, he said, his voice shifting into something harder. I know this is difficult, Kim, but you need to understand something. You've been dependent on me for a long time. Financially, emotionally, professionally. This is going to be an adjustment for you. Dependent on him. The irony was so perfect, it was almost artistic. I just want to make sure you're prepared for reality, he continued. Living on your own, managing your own expenses, building a life without the security I've provided. It's going to be challenging. He leaned forward slightly, his expression taking on what he probably thought was sympathetic concern, but looked more like condescending pity. You're going to discover what it's really like to live paycheck to paycheck. What it feels like when you can't afford the things you're used to having, when you have to make choices between paying rent and buying groceries. I stared at him. This man who'd been living off my income for 8 years while conducting an affair with money he'd stolen from our marriage. Kim, he said, his voice dropping into what was clearly meant to be his final devastating blow. Now you're going to see what it's like to live in poverty. Live in poverty. David Patterson, who hadn't contributed a legitimate dollar to our household in over a year, was explaining to me what poverty would feel like. I looked at him sitting in our beautiful living room, in our beautiful house that hadn't been paid for in 7 months, wearing his expensive clothes purchased with credit cards that were months behind in payments, and felt something like wonder at the perfection of the moment. You know what, David? I said quietly. I think you're absolutely right. About which part? All of it. You should definitely take the house and the cars and all the joint accounts. You've earned them. His relief was palpable. I'm glad you're being so reasonable about this. Reasonable. That was exactly what I was being. When do you want to make this official? I asked. I was thinking we could meet with lawyers next week. Get the paperwork started. No point to dragging this out longer than necessary. David tinha escolhido advogado de divórcio que cobrava por hora e prometia processos rápidos sem complicações. Exatamente o tipo que não fazia muitas perguntas sobre detalhes financeiros. No point at all. The longer we waited, the more expensive his inheritance was going to become. Perfect, I said. I'll start looking for my own place. That night, after David had gone to bed, I sat in our kitchen and opened my laptop one final time to review our complete financial situation. 7 months of missed mortgage payments, $22,400, 4 months of missed car payments, $3,400, credit card debt with accumulated interest and penalties, $52,000, various other joint obligations in default, $8,200, total debt that David would inherit with the assets he was so eager to claim, $86,000, all of it legally, completely, exclusively his responsibility the moment those divorce papers were signed. I closed the laptop and smiled. David was right about one thing. Someone was definitely about to learn what poverty felt like. November brought the crisp efficiency of legal proceedings and the particular satisfaction that comes from watching carefully planned consequences unfold exactly as intended. David had moved with impressive speed once he'd made his decision. Within 2 weeks of our living room conversation, he'd arranged for lawyers, drafted paperwork, and scheduled our official divorce proceedings with the organizational skills he'd never applied to legitimate business ventures. I'd played my part perfectly. The overwhelmed wife who needed guidance through the complex process of asset division. I'd asked hesitant questions about property rights and financial obligations, letting David's lawyer explain how joint ownership worked and what responsibilities came with inheriting shared assets. Mrs. Patterson, the attorney had said during our preliminary meeting, your husband is assuming all responsibility for the marital debts as part of his claim to the marital assets. This is actually quite favorable for you. Quite favorable. If only he knew how favorable it really was. Você confirmou que todas as informações financeiras estão corretas? Perguntou o advogado. Absolutamente, David respondeu com confiança, sem imaginar que estava confirmando sua própria ruína financeira. David had been magnanimous throughout the entire process, like someone distributing charity to deserving causes. He'd even offered to let me take some of the furniture, as if our shared belongings were his to give away rather than jointly owned property we'd accumulated together. "Take whatever you want from the bedroom and kitchen," he'd said with practiced generosity. "I know this transition is hard for you. Hard for me. Right. The hardest part was maintaining my expression of grateful acceptance while watching him volunteer for financial suicide. The papers were signed on a Thursday morning at David's lawyer's office. I'd dressed carefully for the occasion, conservative business attire that suggested someone taking these proceedings seriously, but not expensively enough to contradict the narrative of financial dependence David had constructed for me. "This concludes the asset transfer and responsibility assumption," the lawyer announced as David signed the final documents. "Mr. Patterson, you now have exclusive ownership of the residence at 47 Maple Street, both vehicles, and all associated joint financial accounts and obligations. All associated joint financial accounts and obligations." Such clean legal language for what was about to become David's financial apocalypse. "Any questions about your new responsibilities?" the attorney asked David. "I think I understand everything," David replied confidently. "I'm taking the assets and the debts that go with them. Clean separation. Clean separation." It was going to be clean, all right. We walked out of the lawyer's office with David looking like someone who'd just closed a successful business deal. He checked his phone immediately, probably texting Rebecca about their newly cleared path to domestic bliss. "I hope this gives you the fresh start you need," he told me as we stood beside our respective cars in the parking garage. Fresh start. If only he knew how fresh my start was about to be compared to his. "Thank you for being so fair about everything," I said, and I meant it. David had been extremely fair. He'd given me exactly what I deserved and taken exactly what he deserved. We drove home separately, to what was now his home exclusively, so I could collect my belongings. I'd already moved most of my important things to my mother's house over the past few weeks, so this was just gathering the last of my clothes and personal items. David busied himself in his office while I packed, probably making arrangements for his new life, or catching up on business communications with Rebecca. He emerged as I was loading my final suitcase into my car. "I guess this is it," he said, with what might have been genuine emotion if it hadn't been completely overshadowed by his obvious eagerness for me to leave. "I guess it is," I replied, closing the trunk with a satisfying thunk. "Kim, I hope you understand that this is really for the best, for both of us." "I completely understand, David. You're getting exactly what you wanted." He nodded and stepped back as I got into my car. Through the windshield, I watched him return to the house. His house, with the confident stride of someone who'd successfully navigated a complex situation and come out ahead. I was pulling out of the driveway when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Chase Bank. I answered cheerfully. "Hello? Mrs. Patterson, this is Jennifer from Chase Bank. I'm calling about your mortgage account ending in 7734. "Oh, Jennifer, I'm so glad you called. There's been a change in our account ownership. As of today, my ex-husband David Patterson has assumed exclusive responsibility for that account." "I see. Could you hold while I update our records?" "Of course." While I waited, I watched David through the living room window, settling into his chair with what looked like a glass of wine, celebrating his victory probably. "Mrs. Patterson, I've updated the account information. Mr. Patterson is now listed as the sole responsible party for this account." "Perfect. However, I should mention that we do need to discuss the current account status with someone immediately. We're showing 7 months of missed payments, and the account is currently in default proceedings. You'll want to speak with Mr. Patterson about that," I said. "I'm no longer associated with the account. Could you provide his direct contact information?" I gave Jennifer David's cell phone number and his new work address, the same office where he'd been conducting his fictional business meetings for the past year. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. We'll be in touch with Mr. Patterson immediately." I hung up and continued driving, my phone ringing again almost immediately. Wells Fargo this time, asking about car payments. Then American Express about credit card balances. Then 3 more banks about various accounts that were now exclusively David's responsibility. By the time I reached my mother's house, I'd transferred contact information for 12 different financial institutions to my ex-husband's phone number. My phone had stopped ringing. His, I imagined, was just getting started. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into the comfortable chair in my mother's guest room. My room. Now, to think about new beginnings and appropriate consequences. Somewhere across town, David was presumably discovering that the house he'd been so eager to claim came with $22,400 in missed mortgage payments. That the cars he'd insisted on keeping had $300-400 in overdue loans. That the joint accounts he'd taken responsibility for included over $50,000 in credit card debt he'd never known existed. He was learning what I'd known for 7 months, that all those bills I'd been handling had been accumulating interest and penalties, while he'd been planning his exit strategy. The beautiful irony was that David had been absolutely right about one thing. Someone was definitely about to discover what it felt like to live paycheck to paycheck. Someone was about to learn what real financial stress looked like. Someone was about to understand what poverty actually meant. It just wasn't going to be me. December arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after storms pass, and you can finally see the landscape they've left behind. For me, that landscape looked remarkably like freedom. For David, it looked more like a financial wasteland. I'd been following his situation from a comfortable distance, the way you might watch news coverage of natural disasters from the safety of your living room. Not because I was vindictive, exactly, but because I was human enough to appreciate when justice served itself. The first wave had hit him within 48 hours of our divorce finalization. 12 different creditors, all with the same message. We need to discuss your overdue account immediately. David, apparently, had spent that first weekend believing these calls were some kind of administrative error. He'd called my mother's house 3 times, his voice shifting from confused to concerned, to increasingly desperate. "Kim, there seems to be some kind of mistake with our account information," he'd said during the first call. "Banks are calling about missed payments, but I thought you'd been handling all the bills." I had been handling all the bills. Very carefully, very strategically. "Those aren't our accounts anymore, David," I'd reminded him gently. "Remember? You assumed responsibility for all the joint financial obligations, but I didn't know there were any problems with the accounts. Now you do." The foreclosure proceedings had accelerated once the bank confirmed that David was the sole responsible party for 7 months of missed payments. Apparently, when you owe $22,400 on a mortgage and can't demonstrate any ability to bring the account current, financial institutions become remarkably unsympathetic about extended payment plans. Rebecca, from what I'd heard through the intricate network of neighborhood gossip, had been less understanding about David's sudden financial complications than he'd probably expected. Turns out that planning a future with someone becomes much less appealing when that someone inherits $86,000 in debt overnight. The business partnership they'd built together had dissolved within 2 weeks of David's financial reality becoming clear. Hard to maintain professional relationships when your business partner can't afford to keep his own lights on. I'd been settling into my new life with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from making good decisions. My mother's guest room had become a surprisingly comfortable home base while I looked for my own apartment. The money I'd protected in her account, nearly $30,000 by the time everything was finalized, gave me options that David would never have expected me to have. I'd even gotten a promotion at work, partly because my stress levels had dropped so dramatically that my performance had improved almost immediately. Funny how much better you function when you're not constantly managing someone else's lies and financial irresponsibility. The apartment I'd found was small but perfect. 1 bedroom, efficient kitchen, huge windows that looked out over the city. More importantly, it was mine. Every decision, from paint colors to furniture placement to what bills got paid when, was exclusively mine to make. I'd furnished it carefully, thoughtfully, with pieces that reflected who I actually was, rather than who David had needed me to be. Bright colors instead of the neutral palette he'd preferred. Books displayed openly instead of hidden away to maintain his aesthetic. A kitchen equipped for actual cooking rather than just reheating takeout. On Christmas Eve, I was arranging flowers I'd bought myself when my phone rang. David's number appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, David." "Kim." His voice sounded different, smaller, somehow. "I wanted to call and I wanted to talk to you about something." "Okay. The house is being foreclosed. The cars have been repossessed. The credit card companies are threatening legal action. I'm sorry to hear that." A long pause. "Did you know? When we got divorced? Did you know about the debts?" It was a fair question, and he deserved an honest answer. "Yes, David, I knew." Another pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't want to know. You spent 8 months lying to me about money while planning to leave me with nothing. You thought you were giving me debt while you kept the assets. But the debt was enormous. Yes, 7 months of missed payments tend to accumulate. Why didn't you pay the bills, Kim? We had money in the accounts." We. Even now, he was still thinking in terms of shared resources that he'd planned to keep for himself. "We had my money in the accounts, David. Money from my actual job that actually existed, unlike your fictional consulting business with Rebecca." Silence. "I gave you exactly what you asked for," I continued. "You wanted the house, the cars, and all the financial responsibility that came with them. You got all of it. This is going to destroy me financially. Probably, but you'll recover. You're smart, you're capable when you're not lying to yourself and everyone around you. And Rebecca demonstrated that your business ideas can actually generate income when you apply them honestly. Rebecca and that's over. I figured it might be. Kim, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any way we could Could we work something out? Some kind of payment plan or, David, we're divorced. Your financial problems are no longer my concern. I know, I just thought we were married for 8 years. We were. And you spent the last year of those 8 years stealing money from our marriage to build a future with someone else. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'm sorry, Kim, for all of it. I know that doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know. Thank you for saying that. Are you okay? Financially, I mean? I looked around my apartment, at the space I'd created with money I'd protected through months of careful planning, at the life I'd built while he was busy destroying the one we'd shared. I'm more than okay, David. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by my windows, watching the city lights sparkle in the winter darkness. Somewhere out there, David was dealing with the consequences of choices he'd made, learning what accountability looks like when you couldn't charm or lie your way out of it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt or betrayed or confused about what had happened to our marriage. I was simply free from the exhausting work of loving someone who didn't value that love, free from the constant anxiety of managing finances with a partner who was systematically undermining them, free from the smaller version of myself that had been willing to accept crumbs of affection and respect. David had been right about one thing. Our divorce had given me exactly the fresh start I needed. It just wasn't the fresh start he'd planned for me. As I sat there, I thought about all the women who might be watching this story unfold, women who had recognized themselves in my situation. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life stories of people who found their strength in unexpected places. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just letting people live with the consequences of their own choices while you build something better for yourself. And sometimes when you give someone exactly what they ask for, they discover it wasn't really what they wanted after all.